so good that there's not a market for it. So there's nothing for us to compare it to. So we've got to figure that problem out. We have a small number of non-depository CDFIs that are members of the home loan bank system. There could be more, but we have been under pressure historically from the Federal Housing Finance Agency in terms of how we evaluate the risk of the collateral that they pledge. So they take a steeper haircut. That puts the value proposition of membership lower. We need to address that problem. So there are a number of things that I think could be incremental in our space, but the first thing that I would tell this administration, the next administration, and any administration is do no harm to this system because of the stability and the support that it provides for affordable housing.
Let me add, we just expanded LIHTC by 12%. We can make the efficiency of that credit more efficient. Qualified contract, right of first refusal, there are other issues that would make it more efficient.
Explain that a little bit more.
Well, AHCIA is a bill that the Action Campaign has led where we've expanded the credit provisions, but there's a host of other efficiencies to, when a property at year 15 comes off of LIHTC, we should do more to make it easier to preserve that as affordable units. Crucial. The additional point is you can't expand LIHTC by 12% and then cut home by 60%. Right? The capital stack of these deals are home. They're CDBG. They're home loan banks. I'd ask the HUD Secretary, join us. We need to maintain funding.
And just because there was a lot of, we're deep into housing policy jargon here. So CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, just explain that briefly, and then Home, explain that briefly.
Yeah, those two programs are block grants to the states. Home primarily is facilitating housing. Community Development Block Grant is more general in that it can support other municipal or state needs. But they're right there in the capital stack when you do a LIHTC deal, and they're crucial subsidies in order to support affordability.
One of the things that it's kind of a segue when you brought up about, with LIHTC, the next really big crisis is going to be the preservation of existing affordable housing stock. So when we look at that, it's really getting the opportunity for potential private investment to be able to have some of the depreciation passed on to private investors into affordable housing using private capital. Because once that expiration occurs, there's no dedicated funding source that goes into the rehab or renovation of affordable housing. And so we've already lost I can't remember, I think we're losing like 500,000 units potentially in the next 2 years. So we need to be really careful, and this is across the nation, about preservation.
One of the things that comes up with housing development in my district, I'm sure it's across the country, is how laborious it can be to put together that capital stack, right? We're talking about a bunch of different acronyms up here, and they basically all have to get stacked up together, right sequence, right time, and then the market flips on you, you gotta start over again. What could make it easier to, yes, we kind of want more of each, but what would also make it easier to stitch them together to actually create a fundable project that doesn't take 7 years to finance?
Well, I'll just speak from our perspective. Each of the 11 home loan banks runs an affordable housing program. It's required by statute. It's regulated by Federal Housing Finance Agency. It's subject to about 20 different regulations and advisory bulletins. It takes a long time for us to get the money out to be a part of the project, and when we are generally one of the last parts of that stack, the gap funding. So we encouraged the last administration, we've encouraged this administration to overhaul that program to make it more efficient for us to get that funding out. It's spread across the country, but it's not an insignificant amount of money. Last year we committed $1.2 billion to affordable housing. A substantial part of that was going through this government regulated program, And if it was easier on the application process, easier on the distribution process, it'd have greater impact. And just to give you an example of the complications of this, in Nevada, the San Francisco Bank recently set aside funds to support Nevada organizations to train them on how to apply for the program. If a program needs training for how to apply for it, it's probably too burdensome.
Well, and I think that on top of that, when you have this capital stack with all these variety of financial tools, every time you're looking at extreme costs, it's more attorneys, more time, so that cost element is really difficult. So it would be helpful as a developer if we knew where we were with our light tech first, and then we filled in that gap, because it takes a long time to pull all of this together.
Do you find that light tech is the long pole in the tent? If you have light tech, does that make it easier to get the others? Or?
Absolutely. So I'm hopeful that this is going to really make a significant change as we move forward and there's more opportunity. Also, maybe expansion of CRA. Now that LIHTC's expanded, it'd be great if banks had to do more in affordable housing.
So let me put up a steel man here. You are Secretary of Treasury and HUD, and you're pitching an expansion of LIHTC, and then a group of economists comes back and makes the case, which I've heard. I've heard actually across a number of economists that LIHTC is not high impact money, that it really is mostly a subsidy to developers, that it displaces what would otherwise already be occurring out in the marketplace, and they don't think that LIHTC should be expanded. What's like the vigorous defense that you want to make for why Congress needs to be expanding LIHTC?
All of the affordable housing that's been built in the last 50 years has been financed by LIHTC. I mean, when you look at the statistics, without it, we would not have the stock we currently have.
Yeah, I would add, if I'm a sophisticated developer and you don't provide that support, I'm going to go build market rate. We have some of the most sophisticated real estate developers building affordable housing because of the credit. But I'll say this, costs have gone up. They've gone up on LIHTC and market rate across the board.
Like $1 million a door, some of the numbers I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I think it's incumbent upon the industry at exactly the time Congress is putting more into it for all of us to control cost.
So that's a good segue to the third hat to wear, which is you're a sort of a housing development and technology entrepreneur. And you're trying to decide what you're going to disrupt. And there's, there's off-site construction and manufactured housing. There's been obviously the ADUs that you mentioned. Talk to me a little bit about how you think the industry can take out some cost on the construction and development side.
I would say the first place that you start is with modular.
Modular.
Because it really solves multiple problems. We have a housing construction workforce shortage in this country that's been increasingly so since the housing recession. And so to do site-built work, we just don't have enough people who have those skills, and that takes a long time and it's costly. Whereas with modular construction, it is built in a factory. It can be built in a way that is much more cost-effective, and you can concentrate workforce programs in a community and bring a lot of job opportunity that is skilled labor opportunity to a specific community. And what that also needs is a complementary national building code so that can be constructed in a number of different locations across the country and then shipped out to wherever it is needed and affixed so that it's real estate.
Like changes to the chassis rules or...
Exactly.
What would you be recommending to HUD on those as an entrepreneur?
Well, as an entrepreneur, you actually do have a voice to work with groups like ours and other groups to go and communicate with HUD to say that the chassis requirement, is a challenge, and there have been some sort of developmental opportunities here, just demonstration projects. We can build those 5 million units if a substantial number of them are modular. And by the way, that also helps to solve for construction needs where there's massive scale disasters. like in the Gulf Coast area or in places like California or in Lahaina where fire has struck. And then you can rebuild communities so that people can be part of the community that they're in and rebound the economy in that community, which has a long-standing effect beyond just having people housed stably.
There's also, just as a piece also I would talk about is RAD conversions. Home funds cannot be used for operating costs or for construction at the development level. And so it makes it very difficult on developers to be able to do those conversions for public housing. So I would
just say a little bit more what kind of conversion you're talking about. From what to what?
From they were public housing units.
Yes.
And they're going to Section 8 units. They're going to, and so you are not able to utilize those funds for construction or operating costs, which really significantly impacts the developer. So it would be very helpful to change that.
Yeah, I think the Road to Housing bill in the Senate needs mentioning because they both expand RAD and they expand the modular standard at HUD. But to your question, I would go raise money.
What's the name of that bill? Sorry.
It's called Road to Housing.
Road to Housing.
Senator Scott, Senator Warren, bipartisan, voice vote out of Senate Banking, really extraordinary. Speaks to the politics of the issue.
Yep.
Modular, I would go raise money for a manufacturing facility to do SIPs paneling. SIPs is basically the walls. I would do it for small homes that could be used as an ADU, but could be, a 600 square foot, one bedroom, one bath for elderly veterans. It can be placed on the back of the lot, the front of the lot, and we built one 550 square foot, 14 foot ceilings, front porch, 14 panels on a flatbed that we stood up on the National Mall in 9 hours. Now, you need to put carpet in after, but all the appliances, the air conditioning, and the skilled labor, you need less. But you begin to solve this problem as you look at California and Oregon as to what they're doing with ADUs, with smaller footprints and modular and SIPs.
In this enterprise, they're also oftentimes very helpful to have community landowning partners. What I'm seeing increasingly is colleges and churches are two examples of nonprofits that have been trying to develop on site. Is that something I'm only seeing in my district, or is that something that you're seeing across the country?
I know that for California, we were a leader in that before even the zoning had changed in the state. It took us years, but we did do church-owned property, affordable housing, and now that that zoning law is intact, we are really focused on that. It is, being a nonprofit, you're mission-driven, so when you have that church-owned property, it works really well for everyone involved.
Yes.
And the community seems to really embrace it. So
I've seen that too.
There are some other community-owned models that are not just nonprofits, and those are great, but like the co-op model, sort of from intention, even in single-family locations where the zoning, like in places like California, allows for it, you can build a number of private residences that are co-ops where the land is sort of the community-owned asset, and the entry point for individuals is a much lower cost.
Yes.
And then you're not taking up as much of a footprint as you would have if you had built an apartment building that was several stories.
Can you explain the co-op model? Just because I think it's a little bit more alien to Americans than probably it should be. There was a great piece in the New York Times a couple of days ago about this and how they do it in Switzerland. Just to kind of give a high-level explanation of why it's the third way between renting and owning.
Yeah, I mean, it proliferates in places like New York that are accustomed to density, but in other places, including Seattle and California, it's increasingly a third way, to your point. So essentially, the collective of people who are going to be owners collectively own the land. Yep. And they purchase shares, which entitle them to ownership in the co-op. And that makes the entry point a much lower entry point. It could be as low as $10,000 or $40,000 as opposed to what we commonly think of as a 20% down on a median-priced home.
And the co-op is itself structured as a nonprofit, oftentimes actually subsidized with public money?
It can be, or it can be structured as a private structure. So it has sort of 31 flavors, if you will, a lot of flexibility to be able to create for itself as a nonprofit, or it can be a private structure entity.
And the thing that my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong about this, you come in, you have ownership of the co-op. The thing that you are sort of giving up to get that lower price point is you're not getting the appreciation if you were to sell it, right?
In some cases, yes, and then you also are. Depending on how the co-op is structured, you might give up or sort of have a collective experience in terms of who gets to buy into the community. And so that's where fair housing laws are important to make sure that the structure is something that's welcome to people, irrespective of who they are.
Got it.
Let me add, Enterprise has worked very closely in the last few years on a pilot that is beginning to see some scale. It's not a co-op, but it's a renter's wealth creation fund. The renter pays rent, and over a period of time, a portion of that rent gets placed in escrow. If you recap the property, those renters get a distribution as if they had equity. We've got several financial partners that are supporting us, but it's really having an impact. Call it, a synthetic equity that's really driving wealth for the renters in those projects.
Is that similar to like the rent to own that you see a lot going on across the country? I know I've seen it in Texas and in California, and it's taking some legs to it.
Yeah, it's harder to do homeownership in a multifamily, but the cash is real, right? Like you've been a tenant in our building, you're owed based on the formula, and if there is appreciation to the asset, you're going to get your share.
What you're saying goes to the heart of this tension we have in housing policy, which is, on the one hand, we tell people your house is your best asset, like get that thing to appreciate. On the other side, we say, well, we need more affordable housing. Those are two different things that we're saying. We want housing to get cheaper, or we want housing to get more expensive. But those are two different statements, and we fail to resolve it. And I think we see it that manifests in, I think, a erratic housing policy. I think you want people to have equity and ownership, but fundamentally, housing should be something that is getting cheaper over time. It is something that should be for shelter, not a bank account. What haven't I asked?
I would say that there's a holistic approach to housing, and I think that we really need to focus as a country on elevating the self-sufficiency of those that go into affordable housing to create the opportunity for home buyership. And I think that resident services, we offer that at all of our communities free of charge to elevate the well-being and wealth of those residents, to make room for the families that then do need it. Whether it's saving share, or it's financial counseling, or it's free after-school programs so that parents can continue to work. Those resident services are key. And one of your colleagues, Mr. Aguilar, just introduced a bill that would provide federal funding for resident services that are not provided if a property is not public housing currently. So I think that's a very important component to the holistic approach of what we're trying to achieve.
Can I offer another potential avenue for federal funding for those wraparound services is for senior living communities that do fall prevention, social isolation, any kind of long-term services and supports, right? That's Medicaid funding, that's state funding. But it offsets a lot of hospitalizations that Medicare federal would be paying for, right? And no state has been able to get a negotiation agreed as part of an 1115 waiver that basically says, we want to do all of the long-term services and support, we want to do all the good stuff that we know works, but we want to share those savings from Medicare, right? That's a big pot of money to tap into.
And we actually, thank you for saying that. It's a very important point. When you look at the recidivism throughout emergency rooms with particularly seniors or those that do not have homes. Dual
eligible population.
Yeah, we actually worked with our local healthcare provider, and they invested into one of our properties for 5 units for their seniors as a pilot program, because they could save up to $6,000 a month compared to what we would charge, or for their apartment. So, HHS is actually part of that grant that I'm talking about that Congressman Aguilar is putting through for resident services. So there is a combo. We need to break down that silo. It's an important one.
Most expensive real estate in America is the ICU, right? So. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for your expertise, your insights. I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for coming to this conversation.
Congressman Auchincloss, we'll ask our panelists to stay up here. Congressman Auchincloss, they've called the vote, so he's going to depart. But we'll take some Q&A from the audience during that time. So if there are any questions from the audience, please raise your hand. Going once? Going twice? There we go.
Hi. I know at least one of you mentioned qualified contracts and how that plays into LIHTC and housing. Could you speak to the need for, or whether there should be a federal, a way to address that at the federal level? I know a lot of states have been addressing it through, QAPs, that kind of thing. How important is addressing that and, losing housing units through that in LIHTC to all of you?
Well, since I'm the one who brought it up, you've scratched the surface of my knowledge on how deep we go on QC contracts. Ariane here is on our team and works closely there. My guess is, since it's included in AHCIA, our view is it'd be more efficient to address at the federal level. But I know there's a lot of activity at the state level through QAPs.
Other questions?
Great, thank you. This is very informative. Both Pat and I think Lorraine, you both talked about the need to preserve affordable housing. Can you both talk a little bit more about, after the 15-year LIHTC window, we look around, we see a lot of new construction happening throughout DC and other communities as well. But there are a lot of communities where people have lived in and they're comfortable, they're building families, they're close to workplaces and others, that we hate to lose those as affordable communities. And how can we prevent that?
Well, I think that there's it really should be a private partnership. There's that option to really, just like we have with LIHTC, where corporations can invest in affordable housing. If we could have a similar tax incentive for a private investment into affordable housing, that once the 15-year expires, that there is a dedicated source of funding into affordable housing for renovation and rehab, particularly across rural America. This is a real problem with the 515s. Really need to look at that and address that as an issue. And I know that Congressman Gomez and several others have looked at this as a need to investigate. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, and let me speak more to that as well. I think Neighborhood Homes Improvement Act, the RHS decoupling, right? It's supporting the project in rural areas, even if there's no USDA mortgage. Very important legislative item. Let me add two additional. We can be doing more with the Opportunity Zone program. We should lower the substantial improvement test to about 20% for these particular projects. You can't put 100% renovation on your 15 LIHTC deal. It doesn't require that much. If we lowered it to 20 and tied it to LIHTC investment, I think you could see more Opportunity Zone investment in preservation.
Great. Other questions?
So I was interested in the discussion about Medicaid and seniors, because a voucher is whatever, $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 a year, and yet nursing home costs are 5-10 times that. seems like there are a lot of seniors are ending up in nursing homes that, in part because they can't afford a place to live. It seems like there's a lot of opportunities there to save money and also keep people age in place. What's going on, and what do you see as the breakthroughs that would make more use of that?
I think the breakthrough really has to be in breaking down that silo between, HHS and HUD, and really bringing together the opportunity for funding from HHS into housing, which is a very difficult lift, obviously. But you can't have healthy people if you don't have housing. They really do go together. So it's really breaking down that silo, seeing what opportunities there are. That's, like I said, it's a heavy lift. It's a hard one right now in this current time.
Great. Any other questions for our experts? Going once. Going twice.
All right, thank you to our panelists. Votes were called, so we have a bit of a break here. We encourage everyone to have some additional coffee and snacks, which will be departing from this room at 2:15. So please enjoy. And we will reconvene for a 2:15 panel. Excellent. Thank you so much. All right.
We're good on time?
So I just wanted to give everyone an update. The last vote has been called. Congressman Torres is on his way. He'll be our moderator for the next panel. So if you'd like a refreshment or a cookie, now is your time, and then make your way back to your seats. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Our fourth panel is titled Prioritizing Renters and Federal Policy. Half of American households rent, and this panel will focus on how federal policy can protect and support renters. Moderating is Congressman Richie Torres, who represents New York's 15th District and serves in both the Public Housing Caucus and the Renters Caucus. Please. Joining him are Kim Johnson with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Cynthia Cuestas with the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities, Nikitra Bailey with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and as always, we'll wrap with Q&A. Congressman, take it away.
Thank you. So I'll speak briefly because all of you came to hear directly from the experts, but for me, housing is not an abstraction. It's something that I've lived in my own life. I was born and raised in public housing, and I would have been homeless. My family would have been homeless were it not for public housing and the stability it gave me and my family. And we're facing the deepest affordability crisis since the Great Depression. Our affordability crisis in America is largely a housing affordability crisis. Our inflation crisis is largely, or disproportionately, a housing inflation crisis. And, I represent the Bronx, and it's often said when America sneezes, the Bronx gets the flu. And 10% of the households in my area have eviction cases. The median income in my district is about $45,000, which is less than a third of the income that you would need to afford the median rent in New York City. And there are multiple cities in New York where you have to earn six figures simply to afford the median rent. And the demand is overwhelming. There was a senior development in my district that received 26,000 applications just for 84 units. 300 applicants chasing after a single unit. Or about a year ago, the New York City Housing Authority, which is the largest provider of affordable housing in the country, reopened the Section 8 waiting list for the first time in 15 years. It received a staggering 600,000 applications. So the need is overwhelming. It's much deeper. It's much broader than people realize. It's neither Democratic nor Republican. It's neither rural and urban. It's truly a universal crisis. And yet, even though housing is central to all of our lives, it gets far less attention and far fewer resources than it desperately needs. So that's my diagnosis, but I would be curious to hear from each of the panelists. What's your diagnosis of the housing affordability crisis, and what are the best federal prescriptions and actions that can be undertaken to address the root causes of the crisis? Easy question.
Yeah, easy question, easy answers. Thank you so much, Representative Torres, for having us, and to everybody for joining, and of course for your partnership and championing of affordable housing solutions and the needs of tenants. So I want to start off by just echoing some of the points that you made, Congressman. One, we know that renters are struggling more than ever with the high cost of rent. That is a statistic that really reaches across income levels, but there is no group more impacted than people who are paid the lowest wages, low-wage workers, people with disabilities, people living on fixed incomes, who are really struggling and find themselves constantly on the verge of housing insecurity and homelessness. The other issue, I think, too, is the country's severe shortage of affordable, available, and accessible homes. We know that there's a 7.1 million unit shortage of affordable, available homes for people, again, with the lowest incomes. And that shortage puts pressure across the income spectrum and pushes up rents for everyone. So we won't begin to address the needs of renters until we really start to address the needs of renters with the lowest incomes. And finally, before I pass it on over to my colleagues for their input, just to point out too, the power imbalance between landlords and housing providers and renters also puts renters at a disproportionate risk of eviction and, of course, in worst cases, homelessness. So part of the puzzle is also going to be ensuring that renters have adequate protections and that fair housing laws are adequately enforced.
Hi, everyone. First off, I just wanted to thank Congressman Jimmy Gomez for hosting this summit and for having CLAFA to participate at this panel. It's been great working with the staffer, Ethan Dodd, and for the past half year, and I look forward to working with his office. And I also want to thank Congressman Torres just for being an advocate and a leader in this space in public housing. And CLAFA, we enjoy working with you, so thank you. So here at CLAFA, we focus on extremely low-income renters, and these renters are households earning below 30% of AMI or have little to no income. So they will most likely rely on housing subsidies to obtain housing in the market. I think it's also important to note that these renters will most likely rely on subsidized housing forever, for as long as they live, just because a lot of them are older adults or people with disabilities. I think the most urgent challenge and puzzle to this is the potential funding cuts to HUD in the fiscal year 2026 budget, and now a potential government shutdown. This is the main symptom of a very large problem, and it's a crisis that happens every fiscal year. The HUD budget only makes up 2% or less of the entire federal budget, yet Congress consistently inadequately funds these programs. In public housing alone, there are over 1.1 million units and over 2.2 million people who rely on this housing, and if Congress continues to provide inadequate funding, these renters are at risk of losing their homes.
Thank you. Let me also echo thanks to Congressman Gomez and to you for today's discussion. I'm Nikitra Bailey. I serve as Executive Vice President at the National Fair Housing Alliance. And at the National Fair Housing Alliance, we're the only national organization that's a civil rights agency focused on ending housing discrimination and creating equitable housing opportunities. We are in the throes of a fair and affordable housing crisis, and we continue to do what we've always done. We try to solve for affordability without solving for fairness, and it continues to produce the same horrible outcome. We are in a situation where discrimination distorts the marketplace. Thousands of policies and laws have entrenched residential segregation and created systems in housing and banking that make it really difficult for people to have an opportunity to determine where they want to live. And that's one of the things that's central to our work at NAFA. Where you live matters. It determines everything about you, whether you'll have access to quality groceries, whether you'll have access to fair credit opportunities, whether you'll have access to a high-quality, well-resourced education, whether you'll have access to quality health care. And yet we continue to try to tackle the affordability issue by not solving for the fair housing issues. We absolutely have to ensure our nation's fair housing and lending laws are fully enforced. And instead of what we see happening at the federal level, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, where we see the current administration making attempts to undermine fair housing, what we are setting ourselves up for are more expensive opportunities for families as opposed to the less expensive housing opportunities that they have demanded, especially in November. They wanted people to come to Washington, D.C. and solve the nation's fair and affordable housing crisis, yet instead the actions have been actually making it worse and increasing the cost of housing for very vulnerable families, including disabled veterans, seniors, families with children, people of color, and others who have been hamstrung by our nation's housing policies and haven't had a fair chance to determine where they could actually live and thrive, and have been left behind, which ultimately hurts them but also hurts all of us.
Kim, I mentioned earlier that my district, 10% of the households in the Bronx have eviction cases. And during COVID, we in Congress appropriated around $44 billion for emergency rental assistance, but did so only temporarily. Rather than wait for the next crisis, should we establish a permanent emergency rental assistance fund?
Yes. End of question. No.
And why?
No. So yes, during the pandemic, we saw the federal, state, and local governments really mobilize around housing security and ensuring people did not fall into homelessness and people experiencing homelessness could find safe shelters. We saw this outpouring of resources and attention in a way that we had never really seen before, in a way that really matched the urgency and crisis of that moment. that emergency rental assistance program provided a vital lifeline, and states and localities and advocates all across the country really created those programs at the same time they were trying to administer those funds to get them out to households as quickly as possible to make sure people did not fall into eviction. And all of that hustling, all of that rush really worked. We ended up getting money to households who were most in need, who were facing eviction, who were most likely to fall into homelessness. And as a result of all of that work, we saw evictions go down. We saw homelessness rates drop. But since then, that funding has, of course, not even, expired. It's run out because even that $44 billion was not sufficient to meet the level of need across the country. And so one of the big lessons that we learned from emergency rental assistance is, one, the necessity of getting that funding out as quickly as possible and with low barriers so that people can actually avoid eviction before it takes place. But also, two, the fact that emergency rental assistance is a very vital tool, and just one tool in what should be a tool belt of many to help provide long-term housing stability. Emergency rental assistance can really provide that important bridge financing, that gap funding for families who are facing a sudden emergency that puts them at risk of housing instability or homelessness. But fundamentally, we also need those long-term, large-scale investments that ensure long-term housing stability for families across the income spectrum.
Cynthia, we're celebrating the 90th anniversary of the first public housing development in the United States. It's First Houses in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But public housing is in a state of accelerated deterioration. The numbers are just shocking. The New York City Housing Authority, which accounts for about 15% of the public housing stock, has an $80 billion capital need, which tells me that the national public housing stock must have a capital need upward of $100 billion. It's discouraging when you hear numbers like $100 billion. So what's the game-changing solution to a $100 billion plus crisis in public housing?
So thank you so much, Congressman, for asking this important question, because I think Congress really needs to start talking about this. So to rehabilitate and modernize the public housing stock, housing authorities rely on the Public Housing Capital Fund, and that's appropriated through Congress each year. Unfortunately, Congress has only appropriated under $3 billion for the capital fund, but ongoing accrual needs have increased dramatically. In 2010, HUD did a study on the capital needs for public housing, and they estimated that to be $25 billion for the capital backlog for public housing. That's an insane number, but factoring inflation, the fact that it's a 15-year-old study and ongoing accrual needs, CLAFA, we estimate that number to be much larger. So it's really difficult to provide a number to Congress since HUD hasn't conducted a study for so long. However, I'm really excited to share that CLAFA is a convener of something called the Public Housing 10-Year Roadmap. And Congressman Torres, thank you so much for being part of this initiative as co-chair. And we actually have a few organizations who are part of this summit, the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, Enterprise, the Center, and the National Income Housing Coalition, who are part of this big effort to figure out a new number to set forth to Congress. And I'm excited to share that we will be releasing that number next month with Congressman Torres at one of our meetings. So we'll be sharing more about that soon. Thank you.
Fair housing. So I have colleagues who feel racism, discrimination, it's all a thing of the past. Tell us why fair housing is a continuing necessity in 2025.
Thank you for the question. So as I...
Although it tends to be the Republican colleagues. I'm not aware of any Democrats who deny racial discrimination.
So as I started, discrimination distorts the market, and it's just really important to continue to make that point because our markets are underperforming. Discrimination targeted at black communities alone has cost our economy $5 trillion over the last 5 years. So we could actually, let me say that discrimination targeted at black Americans alone has cost our economy $16 trillion over the last 20 years. And we could actually grow our economy by $5 trillion over the next 5 years if we solved it. So fair housing has always been a part of our systems and our structures. And people don't realize we actually passed the first fair housing law in 1866. People don't realize that. They are more familiar with the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which is the result of Dr. King's tremendous leadership and life work, where Congress responded to his sacrifice with the Fair Housing Act, because people don't know that he was actually living in Chicago and fighting for things like open housing. And fair housing with the 1968 Act became the national policy of the United States. So it said that we are going to have federal legislation with teeth in it. We're going to actually stop the discrimination and make it illegal. And then we're going to have an affirmative responsibility to create inclusive and thriving communities for everyone. And that's why our nation's Fair Housing Act is such a landmark piece of legislation, because it has the potential to transform lives for everyone in our nation. It could be the glue that allows us to build community, but instead what we've done is we've created these unnecessary divisions, because we've seen administrations fail to stand up for the fundamental principle of fair housing. And in fact, currently, we see an all-out assault on fair housing, and it is undermining economic opportunity, and it's doing something that's even a little bit deeper that we just don't talk about enough. It's not valuing the lives of people. Fair housing is really about people and who should have access to opportunity in our nation. And when we fail to fully enforce our nation's fair housing laws, we're saying to disabled veterans, and to older Americans, and to families with children, and to people of color, that they don't deserve opportunity in these United States of America, despite the Constitution and so many of our laws guaranteeing them that. So when we see attacks on the Fair Housing Initiatives program, it's very unfortunate, because this was bipartisan legislation passed in 1987. Reagan was the president of the United States. So it's always enjoyed very strong bipartisan support. And whenever we come and talk to members of Congress like yourself, people say we fundamentally support fair housing. Yet when we talk about reforming exclusionary zoning laws at the local level and using things like our affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act, which allows us to provide for community input and discussion around housing resources are allocated and spent in communities so that everyone can have access to the opportunities that I talked about earlier, that's when these unnecessary divides happen. But we can't solve for affordability without things like the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision.
Now, the point about exclusionary zoning, 5 minutes until Q&A, elected officials, we're not time constrained. The point about exclusionary zoning is a powerful one, because in order to address the affordability crisis, we need more housing subsidy and more housing supply, but the housing subsidy will only take us so far without expanded housing supply. And one of the greatest barriers is exclusionary zoning, often racist zoning, at the state and local level. Question for Cynthia. You brought up the Trump budget. Donald Trump is proposing to effectively cut housing programs in half, but he's proposing time limits on programs like public housing and Section 8. What impact would that have on access to affordable housing?
It would be disastrous, because when we really need to think about who's living in public housing, like I said earlier, there are people who are older adults, people with disabilities, and people who are at risk of homelessness or who are previously homelessness. We can't just kick people out of subsidized housing. I mean, I'm a 31-year-old woman who can't afford to own a home on my own or rent. What makes you think that somebody who is down on their luck, who needs subsidies, who are struggling day by day, for them to just be kicked out of public housing in 2 years to find housing on the rental market? So it would be disastrous, especially for people with disabilities and older adults, and definitely do not commend the administration's proposal on that.
Kim, the National Low Income Housing Coalition just has a useful tool for thinking about the affordability crisis, the relationship between wages and rent. Can you speak about the housing wage concept?
Yeah, I would be happy to. Thank you so much for asking. So we actually just published the latest edition of the report that publishes the housing wage, which is called Out of Reach. And the housing wage is how much per hour a worker earning the prevailing federal minimum wage would need to, or rather, how many hours per week a worker earning the prevailing federal minimum wage would need to work in order to reasonably afford a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in their area at fair market rent. So that is a lot of words to say. Basically, how much does somebody need to make in order to afford rent without paying more than 30% of their income on rent? And most recently, I believe the national federal housing wage is something like $31 an hour, which, if you are not familiar, the prevailing federal minimum wage is still $7.25 per hour. And so that also means if you're making the federal minimum wage, you need to be working at least 2 full-time jobs, almost 3, in order to reasonably afford a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And if you're working that many hours, how much time left over at the end of the day do you have to cook for yourself and your family, to help your kids with their homework, to do all of the other things that people need to do in order to live fulfilling and meaningful lives, all of the things that people should be able to do while also just working 8 hours a day, and should be able to earn enough in order to live comfortably still.
And I'll ask a leading question. In how many counties can a minimum wage worker afford a 2-bedroom apartment? 3,000 counties in America. How many?
Trick question, 0. There is not a single county in the United States in which a family or a household earning the prevailing minimum wage can reasonably afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent.
Can you speak more about exclusionary zoning, redlining, and I've heard much concerns about really insurance. Like I feel, and I could be, that we're paying much higher rates of insurance in places like the Bronx, which have high concentrations of Section 8, and that feels to me like a form of discrimination. But I would love to know what you're seeing on the ground.
We're seeing the inability to build the necessary affordable housing units that we need in our nation. We need over 5 million of these units, and the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act would allow localities to reform those ordinances through a community-based planning process that brings in the voices of local people in their neighborhoods and help us do something in a structural way to advance opportunity in those communities. It's one of the only federal tools we have to increase the supply of affordable housing. Most people think we can just kind of magically say we need to do more things at the local level, but the federal government's power is really limited, and the affirmatively furthering Fair Housing Act provision of the Fair Housing Act is a critical tool to increase that supply. And then in terms of broader discrimination, every year we produce a trends report, a fair housing trends report, and we see that there are about or over 4 million incidents of housing discrimination every year. And most of these incidents of discrimination in housing actually are unreported. And we're seeing record highs, and people with disabilities are especially impacted. And we're also seeing highs in complaints of harassment and color. So enforcing our nation's fair housing and other civil rights laws means that people will have, one, the ability to determine where they can live, and we can have solutions to making housing affordable for all of us.
So time is up. If you have hard probing questions, direct it to the panelists. If you have compliments masquerading as questions, feel free to direct them toward me. But happy to take any questions you have.
Hi, Guillermo Mena from the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. This is not my area of expertise, what I'm going to ask right now, but I was struck by comments that 2 of you made when you started, saying that it was important to enforce the current housing laws, and it struck me that it seems that pretty clear that those current laws are not enough, and talking about enforcing them, doesn't strike me as the actual solution, but actually, doing some further policy work so that maybe the enforcement is not as hard, because I can't believe that in all cases of non-enforcement it's because somebody has gone out and said we're not going to enforce this, right? There must be some hurdles there that are structural, that are impeding that the goal from being served?
Maya Angelou once said the most important virtue is courage, because it is the thing that allows us to practice all of the other virtues consistently. We've yet to have the courage to fully enforce our nation's fair housing and civil rights laws. And if we actually did, as I mentioned, we could actually grow economic opportunity in our nation. So I'll just give you an example. The disparate impact rule that is currently being considered by the current administration. It is designed to undercut a principle that has been upheld by the nation's highest court for over 50 years and many other federal courts for discrimination that isn't obvious. And I'm just going to give you a practical example of what it is. Say you are a person with a disability and you want to rent a home. Well, the landlord might have a requirement, that you have to have a full-time job. On its face, for a person who doesn't understand that people with disabilities often work in part-time employment opportunities, you would look at that and say, Nikitra, what's wrong with that? You're excluding a whole bunch of people who should have access to fair housing opportunities and have kitchens and bathrooms that are suitable for them to maneuver in their homes. So when we fail to fully enforce our nation's fair housing and lending laws, we actually deny opportunity to people who might have a disability, who are deserving, going back to my bigger point, who are deserving of fair housing opportunity. So I would propose to you that we've yet to actually use the laws that we have in an effective way. And if we were talking just a little bit more broadly about these laws beyond just the rental sector, we haven't given every community the fair opportunities that they deserve. And when we do that, all of us benefit.
Hi, Lev Boonin, YIMBY Democrats for America. We talk a lot about the importance of building more affordable housing and expanding the supply, especially in communities which are most in need of them. However, it seems like there has been such a cycle of disinvestment and broken promises in a lot of these communities that when housing starts to get built, there is a uproar in many communities, and they start to oppose building the very housing that, at least on paper, they need. For example, we hear stories all the time coming out, like New York, of a proposed development that would add 500 new affordable housing units, and people get up in arms that it's not enough affordable housing units, and by the end of the development cycle, it's only 200 affordable housing units. How do we, as people who know the subjects and know that what works, get out into the communities better and better communicate and educate so that we can help to build better grassroots support for these policies and overcome the cycle of broken promises that has made them so distrustful?
So it's a travesty of justice that the Build Back Better Act didn't pass with $150 billion in housing provisions, and that it wasn't part of the infrastructure laws. It's just a travesty. And that legislation included the Housing Crisis Response Act. It was $150 billion that advocates and industry negotiated along with policymakers. It actually took all of us coming together to get to something that we all could live with. Now, were we all perfectly happy and singing our best and brightest song? Absolutely not. But we were going to do a lot of good for a lot of people. And it was an opportunity to go into communities and help everyday people understand how that legislation could have driven down the thing that is their primary cost. The cost of housing is a major kitchen table issue for every American. It's no longer just low-income families. Upper-income families are also experiencing this distress from housing costs. So what we can do with housing is use it as a unifier, as a way to really go into communities and talk about the possibility that housing offers. Fair and affordable housing strengthens people's lives. It provides high-quality jobs. It provides access to quality health care, and it makes sure our environmental impacts are lessened and fairer.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that too, connecting with people in the community so that, one, they understand, like Nikitra was just saying, the positive impact of affordable housing development, but also looking for organizations and advocates who are already in those communities doing the work to talk to people, to talk to their neighbors, to figure out, what are the talking points that are really effective. Because part of that, one of the things that we need to understand is that distrust is not, of course, unfounded, right? Like, it's founded based on people's experience with the federal government or bigger organizations coming in and making promises and then not necessarily delivering. So really connecting with people on the ground, advocates on the ground who are doing that work, that education building, that kind of movement building, to see how can we support you in those efforts can also be a good way of going about making that change on the ground.
I'll just add, scarcity is not an inevitability, it's a choice. And state and local NIMBYism is artificially restricting the supply of affordable housing in America. And, I think in Congress, we're going to have to seriously consider whether we incentivize or even require states and localities to adopt pro-housing policies as a condition of receiving federal funding, because the status quo is indefensible and unsustainable. So, next question. And this will be our last one. Can we squeeze in one more? No, I'm being overruled.
Yeah,
I'm being overruled, okay. Thank you, everyone.
Another round of applause.
Switching out the waters here at my pen, but same setup, 1, 2, 3, please. And then one more of you over.
Our final panel of the day is titled Combating the Eviction and Homelessness Crisis. This discussion will cover urgent strategies to keep people in their homes and to confront the homelessness crisis that's straining people in neighborhoods across the country. Moderating is Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, who represents Illinois' 3rd District and serves as chair of the Homelessness Caucus. Joining her are Steve Berg with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Noel Porter with the National Housing Law Project, and Peter Hepburn with Eviction Lab at Princeton University. As always, we'll conclude this panel with Q&A. Congresswoman Ramirez.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. How are you today? Have we had really thoughtful, engaging, active conversations about how we address the issue of housing accessibility, affordability, and how we prioritize housing? I don't know, that wasn't promising. That was not promising. Listen, we just came from the House floor from really controversial votes. I was hoping to have a little bit more energy here, so hopefully no pressure on us as we're wrapping up today to create it. But it is so good to be with all of you. As you heard, my name is Delia Ramirez. I represent Illinois' 3rd Congressional District. I represent a district that half of it is in the northwestern part of the city of Chicago, and the rest is in the northwestern suburbs. And before we begin, I want to thank Congressman Jimmy Gomez for inviting me today to join you for the National Housing Summit. Your leadership and partnership, I think he's somewhere, but I'm sure he'll hear it, has been really critical to our collective efforts and to advance bold housing solutions for working families. So just really grateful for Congressman Gomez's leadership. I also want to thank our panelists who are here today for sharing your expertise and your continued advocacy. We certainly have a lot of work to do. As co-chair of the Homelessness Caucus and former director of a homeless service organization myself, I understand the crisis of housing affordability. I know it's real. I know that it's pervasive, and that we have to urgently work to make housing more affordable, more accessible, and more sustainable. The numbers demonstrate the magnitude of the problem. You know this. There's a staggering 7.1 million shortage. There's 7.1 million units that we have shortage of. And just in Illinois, there are 293,000 units we need of housing in order to address the housing needs in the state of Illinois. 771,480 people are experiencing street and shelter homelessness at any given day. That is a new record. And those numbers include an estimate of 25,832 people who are experiencing homelessness in Chicago or in Illinois, and that also depends on how you define homelessness, because it doesn't include the people that are doubled up, tripled up, or couch surfing. In addition, tens of thousands of families are doubled up, as I just mentioned, and families are spending more than 30%, sometimes up to 50 to 75% of their income for rent and utilities. And we know that between rising utility costs, increasing cost of insurance and property taxes, and climate crisis, forced climate migration, there are numerous factors that can lead to eviction and to homelessness. Home insurance rates are climbing, increasing more than 40% from 2019 to 2024, and projected to cost families an average of $261 more annually this year. The highest climate risk communities are facing cancellation rates 80% higher than low-risk areas, and Latino families are disproportionately affected because in 2021, an estimated 339 billion of Hispanic-owned homes were uninsured, leaving many households more vulnerable to climate disaster. But we also know that the Trump administration is attacking the very tools we need to address the crisis. Their proposed cuts are going to gut affordable housing and the HUD workforce by 50%. The retreat from fair housing protections and enforcement will mean more unchecked discrimination. Their EOs criminalize our unhoused neighbors. Their abuses of HUD data will put mixed status families at greater risk. And while the administration wants to roll back the clock on the progress we've made to make housing more affordable, accessible, and sustainable, we know that we have to demand and to do more work to actually realize this idea that we all have, that housing is a human right. Well, it can't be a human right if we continue to attack the very same mechanisms that make it more affordable, more accessible, and more sustainable. So protecting affordable housing and realizing housing for all will take legislation, it's going to take litigation, and even a thing that we don't talk about enough in the direct service world, which is more mobilization, the advocacy work that we have to do. It's why we're building on that work, and it's why I wanted to build on the work that I did at the state level when I passed one of the largest emergency housing bills to ensure that people were able to stay housed in the middle of the pandemic. I've reintroduced the tenants' right to organize this Congress to ensure that all tenants, including those in mixed status families, organize without fear of retaliation. We've introduced legislation to expand transitional housing for veterans, increasing funding and resources for housing providers who provide permanent housing for veterans. And it's also why I'm so grateful to be with you today and the esteemed panelists that are here. We have Steve Berg, the Chief Policy Officer from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We have Peter Hepburn, the Associate Director from the Eviction Lab. We have Noel Porter, the Director of Government Affairs for the National Housing Law Project, and a partner that worked very closely with my team to introduce the Tenants' Right to Organize bill. And so we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask them a number of questions, and as we've done with the other panels, we'll also leave some time for you to ask some direct questions. So are you ready to get started? Yeah? All right. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and take a seat with all of you to ask the questions here, and I'll probably go this way. I'm a little shorter. So all of you know how important housing is. Many of you, when you've asked someone what is one of the top issues in your community, you will hear housing being one of the top three. The reality is that many of us have said that the rent is too damn high, that millennials have said that over 25% of them have said that they don't know if they're ever going to buy a home, that their parents may have made a little less than they do, but they don't think that they'll be able to access the resources necessary to purchase a home. People are living doubled up and tripled up, And we know that because of some of those monopolies, it's made it even harder for people to be able to access home ownership. So I want to start with talking about homelessness. I ran a homeless service agency. I sheltered both men and families who were, because of the reality of income instability, because of housing instability, and because of many other issues, confronted with homelessness. And so, Steve, I want to talk to you a little bit about homelessness here. When people can't afford or access the health services that they need, it can lead to a loss of housing. Oftentimes, we've heard people say that they have to make a choice between going to the doctor and paying their rent. The most recent reconciliation bill cut healthcare spending by $1 trillion, which could leave about 17 million Americans without access to coverage. That's about a 64% increase for uninsured individuals. So, Steve, can you elaborate more on the connection between homelessness and affordable health care? And can we expect an increase in homelessness because of the Republican reconciliation legislation?
Sure, and thank you, Congresswoman, for your work on this issue. It's been very important. I think the connection between homelessness and healthcare is unfortunately way too evident in communities around the country. I mean, one group of people you can talk to about this is healthcare providers. The healthcare systems in most communities, particularly the state-funded Medicaid systems, homelessness costs them a lot of money, and they know this, and they are desperate for solutions to this problem. They also know that they can help with this because many homeless people, there's the issue of like being able to afford rent when you've also got medical bills, but there's also the fact that many people who become homeless are people with severe disabilities who need health care in order to be stable in the housing they're in. We heard a lot about people with mental illness, people with substance use disorders. Medicaid can pay for treatment for people like that, and that will allow them, if they're coordinated with housing services, to stabilize in housing. But with the reconciliation bill and the changes there, we're going to have to be reaching out to states to ask them to prioritize that even when they have less money available. And that's, I think, particularly for some of the poorer states that have higher rates of homelessness, like New Mexico, for example, is one. They're going to have a hard time with this, and so it's something we're going to need to try to rectify.
So I want to talk a little bit about HUD now, Steve. Last year, HUD estimated that 771,480 people experienced homelessness in one single night. That was the highest ever recorded. Let me go ahead and say that number again. 771,480 people in this country were experiencing homelessness on one single night. The National Alliance on Homelessness estimated that only 16% of states even have sufficient shelter beds for those who need them, and that 0 states had enough permanent supportive housing to house their entire homeless population long term. So, Steve, can you talk a little bit about the link between the shortage of permanent supportive housing and homelessness?
Sure, yeah. Permanent supportive housing is a specific intervention, evidence-based, lots of research to back it up, involving providing subsidized housing along with a range of supportive services really targeted to people that I was talking about before, people with severe disabilities who, without that kind of intensive help, would be homeless for a long period of time. It's a model that works very well. It's been proven over and over again in all kinds of contexts. And the reason there are so many people still on the streets with those kind of disabilities is because the money hasn't really been put on the table to provide the amount of permanent supportive housing that people need. I mean, you can compare this with the situation with veterans. There's way too many veterans who are still homeless, but the fact is the VA over many years has the programs, the homeless programs at the VA have been funded at a much more realistic level than the HUD programs. And one of the results of that is that VA has implemented this HUD-VASH program, which is a permanent supportive housing program for chronically homeless veterans. And you have many, many communities now where you can't find a veteran who's got a severe disability who's living on the streets. This is, a wonderful thing that I never thought would happen when we first started doing this, but it really has worked. And the reason it hasn't worked as well for people who aren't veterans is because the money isn't on the table to do it.
And certainly when we're having conversations with less than 30 days to fund the government, and instead of talking about funding supportive housing, we're talking about defunding it, we're only going to see that number, unfortunately, continue to grow. Noah, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you see some of the housing violations really contributing to even the increase of homelessness as well. Homelessness can result from, yes, fair housing violations, but also sources of income discrimination, unjust evictions, we've seen that, or preventable foreclosures. Strengthening or guarding our housing, defending protections against unfair housing discrimination, and preserving affordable housing stock are some of the reasons National Housing Law Project may represent litigants. So I want to ask you, Noah, what can be done to protect tenants and homeowners before reaching litigation? And if litigation is in fact necessary, how can we ensure that they have access to justice or legal representation?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. I really appreciate, the question. And I will say we're really facing a unique housing market that, in my sort of point of view, has never existed in the U.S. before. And that's an increasingly corporatized market, especially in the rental space. We're looking at the consolidation of a number of interstate or international corporations that are buying up housing stocks in small communities, in large cities, and they're making it harder and harder for tenants to have choice, accessibility, and even just rights and protections in the market. And so while we talk about the rent being way too damn high, one of the most important things we can do is make sure that tenants are able to fight for their own rights, to have choice in the market, and to be able to navigate and say, I choose you because of your rates, because you do not discriminate, because your conditions are habitable, etc. And so I've been around the block enough to say that your bill, the Tenants' Right to Organize Act, is one of the most important things we can do to help tenants who are living in HUD-assisted housing. What your bill would do would give an explicit right to organize to folks in Section 8, folks in LIHTC-assisted housing. Right now, those protections are only explicit for people living in public housing or in project-based rental assistance. Your bill would also increase federal funding to allow those tenants in HUD-subsidized housing to organize. Along with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the Tenant Union Federation, NHLP produced a Tenants' Bill of Rights a few years ago. And that product really is Congress's opportunity, wink, wink, nod, nod to all of your bosses, to introduce different pieces of legislation that really would stand up tenant protections and rights in the market. Among those would be rights to a fair application process, rights to a fair lease, rights to freedom from discrimination, a right to habitable homes. We have conditions issues, especially with HUD-assisted housing across the country, that are really egregious. Reasonable rent and costs, a right to organize, and rights to safeguards against eviction. And so we would really encourage folks to begin to refocus on how tenants who are protected and tenants who have a voice in the market are then able to navigate the market and get increased affordability, better habitability, et cetera.
And as I hear you talk, Noah, I think about tenants with a voice in the market. And I'm just going to, for those of you that know me, you know that I'm going to say, and I'm going to speak truth to power, even if it's in uncomfortable places and one of the few people that are saying it. But the reality is that when we're talking about housing, and housing for all, at least for me, that also includes mixed status families.
Absolutely.
And right now, you are seeing an attack on immigrant communities. Particularly, according to our borders, are individuals that have certain physical appearances, live in particular locations, and have certain occupations. So one of the things that have come up often for me when I've been in district has been the concerns from affordable housing providers who house mixed status families, and fears of retaliation of these organizations for providing, and for the mission that they have of providing affordable housing regardless of legal status. And certainly in certain projects or in certain developments, these are programs that have received federal funding in the past, who now are concerned about what happens with the data, and will that data be used to target against their own participants or people, residents in their program. So I wanted to ask you, Noel, since we know that it's evident that this administration is going after certain vulnerable communities, including immigrants who may be undocumented, can you tell us a little bit about how the administration and HUD's announcement that every public housing authority in the country has 30 days to share citizenship status of tenants or risk losing their federal funding can impact homelessness and safety, and how?
Absolutely. Thank you for, I needed a moment to get the emotion out of this conversation. First, I just want to say that the administration is lying about who mixed status families are. And when the administration says that they are going after undocumented individuals who live in HUD housing, they're grossly misrepresenting who the population is. Mixed status families are families of varying legal immigration status who, through an act of Congress, receive a prorated amount of rental assistance so that those legal immigrants in their families are not actually receiving a HUD subsidy. So let's say 3/5 of the family are U.S. born and 2 are T visa holders. They have an asylum status or they're fleeing violence in their countries. That family would only receive 3/5 of a voucher. And that is Congress's intention, to serve mixed status families with an eye toward taxpayer savings. And also, it really clearly represents who those families are. They're legal families living in the country with specific needs. And so I want to make it clear that first and foremost, we have to attack the rhetoric on the merits. But second, this letter specifically that is sort of rumored and could be coming out any moment that says that PHAs who do not provide specific information to HUD could be defunded fully. And I want to address a few parts of that. One, the letter has not gone out. We've seen a number of organizations, agencies, and PHAs across the country sort of pre-complying with some of the administration's mandates, and we want folks to urge PHAs in their community not to provide data that hasn't been legally requested by the administration. So really, folks don't need to rush to get a bunch of information together for this purpose until we know more about the facts and about the legality of what the administration is proposing. Second, HUD has this data. This request is simply an indication that they are full of stunts, that they are eager to create chilling effects within immigrant communities that scare immigrants into what we would call self-evicting from their housing prior to a legal notice or a legal proceeding. And also that HUD may have so severely understaffed itself under this administration that they're unable to collect their own data internally and to do the work that they're asking PHAs to do. Third, this request would essentially turn PHAs into investigators. HUD is asking PHAs to identify families who may have misrepresented their legal status in this request. That asks PHAs who are simply there to pay the rent and ensure that families are safe and stably housed across their community to become criminal investigators in the sort of DHS system of the country, and that is not the job of PHAs. PHAs are housing providers. And so it would create a huge burden on PHAs who are already significantly understaffed. And then finally, the administration claims in each of its efforts to harm immigrant families that they are doing so on behalf of, quote, American families, and that the removal of immigrant families from subsidy programs across the U.S. will improve those subsidy programs for U.S.-born families. But any sort of threat to defund an entire PHA, a PHA who provides rental assistance in the private market and subsidizes private landlords and owners, a PHA who works with its local COC to ensure that families who are experiencing homelessness are moving out of homelessness and into safe and stable housing, a PHA who is already overburdened with the requirements that may be coming from work requirements and time limits, et cetera, now becomes another rubber stamp on data that they have already collected and data that they have already verified. PHAs across the country do not want to be in the business of enforcement. And so we really want to caution folks that we are not certain what's happening because the letter has not been made public, but that this is a broad overreach of HUD's authority, of the necessity of PHAs to do the work that they are already tasked with doing, and it is largely a symbolic attack on mixed status families who have varying forms of legal reasons to be in this country and to be living successfully in their communities and thriving.
And Noah, I think in many cases we're talking about American children.
Absolutely.
Right? And so we're talking about American children and their parents now having to self-evict and become or experience homelessness as a result of something that we're preempting that has not actually gone down.
Absolutely.
So I really appreciate you answering that question because I know that's come up a lot.
Yeah,
in my
HUD's own
spaces.
numbers from 2019, we have about 120,000 mixed status families. Of those families, 55,000 American-born or U.S.-born children live in those mixed status families alone, not to mention that their legal status parents are Americans as well.
That's right. No, thank you, Noel. So I want to talk a little bit more about evictions before we open it up to the rest of you here for Q&A. And it looks like we're good on time. Good job. Okay. Well, I want to talk to you, Dr. Hepburn, a little bit with the eviction lab. Evictions are devastating for families. I mean, not just families, but the entire community. I mean, I think as I heard Noel talk, all I thought about is a destabilizing of entire local economies as a result of evictions or housing instability. And a court record can prevent families from relocating to dignified housing. When I introduced legislation in the state legislature, I was a state representative before coming here, and we were doing an eviction moratorium. Part of what we were saying was, imagine someone getting evicted in the middle of the pandemic and attempting to find permanent, stable housing. In some cases, people will die trying to find permanent housing because of all the challenges that come from that eviction record as a landlord is verifying if they want to rent to you or not. So I want to ask you, Dr. Hepburn, how does the eviction process and the weaponization of the process by bad actors create a negative spiral that results in more people becoming homeless instead of less?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thank you again for being here. I think, it's important to recognize that there are just a slew of real, meaningful, long-term harms that arise as a result of the eviction process. I mean, we know that going through an eviction case increases your risk of losing your job. It has, long-term damage to your credit score, to your financial well-being, to your physical and your mental health. It increases the odds that your kids are going to have to switch schools or leave schools entirely. It throws off their whole academic trajectory, right? We know that having that eviction on your record is going to make it harder to find safe, decent housing in the future. So you're going to have to accept a worse unit, potentially a more expensive unit than you can really afford in a more dangerous neighborhood. Or you're going to end up doubled up, couch surfing with friends or with family members, relying on them to have a roof over your head. And those situations are really trying and they're difficult. And all too often, that's what precipitates homelessness. We know, you were talking earlier about the number of people experiencing homelessness in this country. The number was about 770,000. Every year in this country, there are about 7.6 million individuals who live in a household that are facing an eviction case. 40% of those are children. The good news here is that not all of them are going to experience homelessness, right? There is not a direct one-to-one relationship where going through the eviction process will lead someone to end up in the shelters or living on the streets. But we know that it sets up those sorts of harder living arrangements or those doubled-up living arrangements that often are the step right before someone ends up experiencing homelessness.
So I want to talk to you about the solutions here. How do we prevent those evictions? And what are the kind of things that states and local municipalities are already doing? Obviously, I'm going to ask you about Congress in a minute, but your research suggests ways that states and cities have worked to address the eviction crisis. You've talked a little bit about some of the things that some states and cities like Illinois have done, like increasing eviction filing fees, establishing programs that provide tenants with legal assistance, which we've done in Illinois, and eviction diversion programs, which we've also done in Illinois. Not to say anything, but representation matters when you have housing leaders in the state legislature. So tell me a little bit, what can we in Congress be doing to confront the situation and recognizing that landlord-tenant laws are largely set at the state and local level? What role do you think the federal government can be playing?
Yeah. So, there are millions of eviction cases that are filed across this country every year. And in many cases, the story boils down, it boils down to a really simple story, right? That the rent is too high. And, if you've ended up in this room today, chances are you appreciate that we need to expand the supply of affordable housing. And I won't try to reiterate, programs and proposals that were offered up by members of the previous panels. I think there's also a lot of creative thinking about how we could expand and improve the Housing Choice Voucher Program to make that program work better. That really offers meaningful affordability for recipients, but far too few families actually receive it. But those sorts of eviction diversion and right to counsel programs that we're seeing crop up across the nation over the last few years, really, those don't come out of nowhere. We've been able to establish those and to maintain those because there's been funding through the American Rescue Plan, through HUD's Eviction Protection Grant Program. Congress needs to make sure that it's providing more funding and that funding is being distributed to local partners to make sure that those programs work. And I also want to just reiterate something that Kim said in the previous panel. We need more rental assistance.
Yeah.
Emergency rental assistance is the secret sauce that makes those programs work. That's such an important investment.
Can I jump in too?
Yeah, just a quick, and then we're going to open it up to if we have a couple questions from the audience.
Absolutely. I just want to say the passage of the 30-day notice provision in the CARES Act, as well as HUD's implementation of the 30-day notice regulation, has changed folks' outlook when they look across the country and maybe they only have 0 to 3 days or 3 to 5 days to prepare for an eviction. 30 days is enough to get rental assistance from your state or local outlet, to recertify your income with your PHA. And so protecting the 30-day notice provision is essential to protecting folks from eviction.
So I know that my ledge person is here. So Valeria, as she's walking, make sure that you're noting that. We already do that, but we want to make sure we tell the other members the same, that protecting the 30-day notice is critical.
Yeah, and this is not just like something that helps folks in red states. This helps people in blue states too.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's across the board.
I'm a professor in the state of New Jersey. New Jersey, there is a 0-day notice period for non-payment of rent cases.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we can talk about this all day, and you've been here all day. So I'm going to see if there's a question you may have for one of our panelists. We might have opportunity for one or two. So, and if you can introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Dr. Ray Serrano with the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. I liked your question, Congresswoman Garcia, or Brother Ramirez, sorry, it's been a long day. The HR1, the funding, $45 billion, and the amount of, a lot of the work our councils are doing at the local level has been supporting those families that have been the targets of deportation. And so you have kids that are facing homelessness, and they are trying to be relocated to be doubled up with a family member. I think a lot of us in the room kind of speak the same language on this issue, right? We care about this issue. We know that one side is passionate about the issue, the other side is not so much. I guess my question is, how do we break that? How do we convince I'll be frank. How do you convince the Republicans to care about this? Because when we talk about deportations and you talk about kids going into foster care, kids facing homelessness, it usually falls into the states. How do we convince a red state governor or a red state congressman or a congressman, a Republican congressman, that this matters to them? Because I feel like quite often we kind of speak that we all share the same values. We share the same views on these issues, but we're not breaking through to the other side, who are just falling in this narrative of just condemning, well, the illegals are living in these places and so forth, and it's just not true. So how do we break that?
Yeah, there's no way we're going to answer that question in a minute. So I definitely should talk to you later, Valeria, make sure that we have an opportunity to talk. But I do want to say just two things real quick. First of all, I think it's really important that across the board we are clear that it is more expensive to help someone move them into permanent housing once they've experienced homelessness than to prevent homelessness, right? I mean, in some cases, I don't know, the last I checked when I was in the space, it was like 3 to 1, right? So I think that for folks that are talking about being fiscally responsible and really maximizing resources, it is better to ensure that people are not becoming homeless. And I think the truth is that when you're talking about the number of people who are becoming or at risk of homelessness because of these fear tactics, oftentimes are United States citizen children. They're also getting deported. So I think that this is a conversation that a couple of us are trying to have more one-on-one with some of our colleagues, because there's just so much rhetoric, right, publicly. And the fear between the National Guard, the conversations about, well, what if a family is experiencing homelessness, or out of fear they self-evicted, and now all of a sudden they're at a local park, but then the National Guard shows up to the local park and picks up the entire family, deports them, including the children. I mean, just think about the trauma that is creating, generational trauma. So it's really, for us, I think, it's been really frustrating, but trying to have some one-on-one conversations. And I'll be honest with you, the other piece that we keep talking about is how does the interfaith community really make a connection? Because we talk about apparently faith more than we thought we would in this place now. So how do some of their advisors talk about this in a way that really connects with them outside of the black and white pushback and public fight that we have? But you and I both know that deportation isn't going to address and make the prices of groceries go down. It's not going to lower the cost of housing. It's actually going to do the opposite. Mm-hmm. So how do we continue to use facts to demonstrate there is a real cost of deportation, and it's only going to worsen the housing crisis? But happy to talk to you offline. I think there was one more. And feel free to jump in. Obviously, you know I get passionate on this issue.
Well, thank you so much, Steve Boyle, YIMBY Democrats for America. First of all, just thank you for everybody, and to Congressman Gomez. It's been amazing. Congresswoman, excuse me, thank you so much for your advocacy. That stat on the amount of people who are on the street in one night is unbearable. Noel, similarly, thank you for your advocacy on immigrants. 3/5 of a voucher. Woof. But Noel, my question is for you. You did mention that some of the housing crisis was the corporatization of housing, and I was curious, when it comes to reducing rents, would you rather we had the same amount of housing we do now, but none of it was corporate owned, or we had 3 times as much, but all of it was corporate owned? And for the purposes of this question, you can assume that none of the corporations are monopolies.
I spent a lot of my 20s playing Would You Rather.
I know, if you can, yeah, I know. And if you can do it in 30 seconds, I'm going to have to pass it on to Congressman Gomez in a second.
I would rather that housing, whether you rent or own, had an access point of equity. The idea that we could have only corporations owning housing and they wouldn't be monopolies is absurd. And so I can't accept the premise of your question, because what we are looking at right now is an incredibly tightening monopolistic market, or at least what are the ones in the middle where there are a couple of owners. So I reject the premise.
To get to my next meeting, but I want to thank the panelists again. I want to thank everyone that is here today and the work that you do on a daily basis to ensure that we are actually creating a higher housing stock, that we're preserving the housing that we have, that we are prioritizing quality housing, not this assumption that people should just be grateful if they have housing regardless of what that housing looks like, and how do we actually address the issue of homelessness and prevent homelessness from happening to begin with. So help me give another big round of applause to our panelists here and to all of you that are here today. I'm going to pass it on, and just another shout out to Congressman Jimmy Gomez for your leadership, for your support. And we have a lot of work to do in Congress, so let me get back to that. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone again for your time. And to wrap up today's summit, please welcome back our host, Congressman Jimmy Gomez, Chair of the Renters and Dads Caucus.
First, let me just thank everybody for being here. Let's give a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you so much. And the different members of Congress, industry, advocates, anybody that was here to participate. This is the first of its kind summit to address the housing crisis. Even people who have been working on this issue for over 20 years have said this has never been done. And one of the things that we want to do is bring together people that are working on different parts of the problem. And how do we kind of make those pieces fit together? As a member of Congress, as a person who sits on Ways and Means, I have people from all different walks of life approach me. So my mind is always thinking, oh, you're working on this, that's interesting. Oh, this person's working on that, that's interesting. How are they working together or not working together? What works, what doesn't work? And that is the only way we're going to solve this problem. One of the ideas which my staff kind of put a kibosh on is I wanted everybody to have one open-ended discussion, leave your phones at the door and get off your talking points, and let's have a royal rumble per se on policy, on politics. How do we actually get this done? Because this is a big problem that is personal, it's political, it is financial, you name it. It is difficult. And I studied housing and urban development when I was an undergrad. I almost focused on it when I got to the Kennedy School. And then I decided, no, I'm going to go a different direction because I understand just how price sensitive, market sensitive, you name it, difficult it can be. But the problem's so much that it's dragging down our GDP. People are losing faith in our system of government itself, and they believe that the system is not going to be able to address their needs or provide them an opportunity to get ahead. So it's not just a housing crisis, it's a crisis in confidence in our system of government itself. We deal with this problem, we deal with a big chunk of the affordability issue, the governance issues, and also a variety of different related topics. But this is at the heart. And today we had a press conference with Hakeem Jeffries, Greg Kassar, who's the chair of the Progressive Caucus, Brad Schneider, who's the chair of the New Democrats, right? Different parts of the ideological spectrum of the Democratic caucus itself, but knowing that they would have to come together in order to provide housing if we win the majority and able to deliver a real package. So for the sooner we get this conversation started, the more likelihood we can make sure that this is prioritized and not end up on the cutting room floor. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here. This was the first, but it won't be the last. We're going to be looking to do this next year. So love to get your feedback on how to improve it, what was missed, what would you like to dig in a little deeper, so that we can make this better. The Republicans are always welcome to attend, but I believe whoever really wants to, if whoever leads on this issue, they're going to be able to, I would think, win not only a congressional district, but a majority in the House. So I won't be surprised if you guys the Republican conference reaches out and tries to do a summit very similar to this in the near future. So thank you so much. Before I end, I want to say, give a round of applause to my staff, Carlos Paz, Kana, Michael, all of them, Ethan. Because everything that I asked for them to do, they exceeded. Even the step and repeat banner in the back, they're like, that's a lot more work than you think it's going to be. So let's give everybody a round of applause. Thank you so much. And if you don't know, we will make sure you get the information for the reception. Carlos, do you have that? Oh, everybody has that. So there's a Friends of the Housing Community reception from 5 to 6 p.m. at La Colina. You're all welcome to attend. It's on Carlos, the drink. So thank you all.
little team photo.